Thomas Mercer's wrists burned against the energy restraints as the guards marched him through corridors that seemed to pulse with living light. The diplomatic mission to the Archean Empire had gone catastrophically wrong. One moment he was presenting humanity's terms for the disputed Thalian sector, and the next he was being dragged away on charges of cosmic insolence, whatever that meant. The Archean guards flanking him stood nearly 8 feet tall, their exoskeletons gleaming with bioluminescent patterns that shifted with their movements. Thomas had studied the Archeans extensively before this mission, but no amount of research had prepared him for the overwhelming alienness of their imperial palace, or the consequences of failing in his diplomatic task. "The Queen will see you now," announced the guard to his right, her voice resonating with a harmonic quality that human vocal cords could never produce. The massive doors before him split open like the petals of some enormous flower, revealing a throne room that defied human architectural understanding. The ceiling soared hundreds of feet overhead, rippling with something that wasn't quite water and wasn't quite light. The floor beneath his feet was transparent, revealing a living ecosystem of creatures swimming in what appeared to be liquid crystal. And there, at the far end, sat Queen Varix of the Archean Empire. Unlike her guards, she was barely taller than Thomas himself, but her presence dominated the cavernous space. Her exoskeleton was the color of burnished copper with intricate patterns of luminescence pulsing across its surface. 4 primary arms were folded regally before her, while 2 smaller secondary limbs adjusted something on the arm of her crystalline throne. Her head, with its compound eyes and elegant sensory antennae, tilted slightly as she regarded him. "Thomas Mercer of Earth," she said, her voice surprisingly melodic. "Your diplomatic credentials have been revoked." Thomas straightened his shoulders despite the restraints. "Your Majesty, I came here in good faith to negotiate." "You came here," she interrupted, presenting demands disguised as negotiations. "The Thalian sector has been under Archean protection for 12,000 years. Your species hasn't even mastered interstellar travel for a full century." The guards forced Thomas to his knees. He winced, but kept his eyes on the Queen. "The standard punishment for such presumption is execution," Queen Varix continued, rising from her throne in one fluid motion. "However, I find myself curious." She descended the crystal steps, her movements graceful despite her alien physiology. As she approached, Thomas noticed that her compound eyes reflected his own image back at him 1,000 times over. "They told me humans were adaptable," she said, circling him. "That your species' only real advantage in this vast cosmos is your remarkable ability to understand and integrate new concepts. Is this true, Thomas Mercer?" Thomas measured his words carefully. "We've survived this long by learning quickly, Your Majesty." A sound emerged from her that might have been laughter. "Then perhaps there is a more educational alternative to your execution." She gestured with her upper right arm, and a portion of the floor rose up, forming a table of sorts between them. The restraints on Thomas's wrists disengaged, allowing him to stand. "This is Kaithvar," she explained as intricate patterns began to glow on the table's surface. "A game of strategy and perception that predates your civilization by millennia." Small crystalline pieces materialized on the board, some glowing with the same copper hue as the Queen's exoskeleton, others with a deep blue that seemed to have been chosen to match Thomas's human eyes. "I propose a challenge, diplomat. If you can defeat me at Kaithvar, you will be free to return to your people. If you lose..." Her antennae quivered with what might have been amusement. "You will belong to me, bound by the ancient laws of right of mind." Thomas stared at the alien game board, his diplomatic training screaming at him to proceed with caution. "And if I refuse to play?" "Then execution remains the simpler option," she replied simply. "Choose now." Thomas studied the Queen's alien features, searching for any tell he could recognize across species. Finding none, he turned his attention to the game board. The pieces seemed to shift subtly even as he watched, as if they existed in more dimensions than he could perceive. "I accept your challenge, Your Majesty," Thomas said, squaring his shoulders. Though I request you explain the basic rules, at least. Queen Varix's mandibles clicked in what might have been satisfaction. The fundamental principle is simple, Thomas Mercer. Perception shapes reality. The rest, you will learn as we play. As she took her position opposite him, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this game was about far more than his freedom. Somehow, he suspected the future relationship between humanity and the Archean Empire now rested on his ability to master an impossible alien challenge. Your move first, Queen Varix said, her compound eyes glittering with anticipation. Choose wisely, human. Thomas stared at the Kathvar board, its crystalline pieces humming with an energy he could almost feel beneath his fingertips. The blue pieces, apparently his, were arranged in a formation that suggested both defense and potential for attack, though against what, he couldn't yet tell. The first move reveals character, Queen Varix said, her antennae quivering slightly. Will you advance boldly or establish your defenses, human? Thomas considered the board. Without knowing the rules, any move was a risk. But doing nothing was certainly a loss. He reached for a piece that seemed centrally positioned, a pyramidal crystal that pulsed more vibrantly than the others when his fingers hovered near. Interesting, Varix murmured as he moved it forward 3 spaces. The thought-bearer. Most begin with a more cautious approach. The moment Thomas set the piece down, it flared brilliantly, and the surrounding pieces, both his and hers, shifted slightly in response, as if pulled by invisible forces. The pieces respond to each other, Thomas observed, watching the ripple effect across the board. Obviously, Varix replied, her upper limbs moving in what might have been the Archean equivalent of a shrug. All things in the universe respond to each other. Kathvar merely makes these connections visible. She moved one of her copper pieces, a curved shard that seemed to bend light around it. Immediately, 3 of Thomas's pieces dimmed slightly. Your pieces lose strength when caught in my Eclipse Maker's shadow, she explained, the light patterns across her exoskeleton brightening with satisfaction. 5 shadows, and the piece is mine. Thomas frowned. You gain my pieces if you surround them 5 times? Not surround. Eclipse. The difference is significant. Her mandibles clicked. Your move. Over the next hour, Thomas lost 7 pieces to Varix's skillful play. Each loss felt like a small defeat, but with each move, the patterns of the game became clearer to him. The board wasn't just a flat surface but seemed to operate on multiple levels that he could almost perceive if he unfocused his eyes just right. You're adapting more quickly than I anticipated, Varix noted after he successfully protected a piece from her 4th eclipse attempt. Most non-Archeans require several games to grasp even the basic energy flows. Thomas moved another piece, creating what he hoped was a defensive formation. I've always been good at pattern recognition. It's why they sent me as a diplomat. A skill your negotiators failed to demonstrate when demanding rights to the Thalian sector. She made another move, elegant and decisive. 2 of your colony ships have already violated our sovereign space. Thomas looked up from the board, surprised. That wasn't in my briefing. If human vessels entered Archean territory, it wasn't authorized. Varix's compound eyes studied him intently. Yet you came with demands for mining rights to planets within our acknowledged borders. We were told those systems were unclaimed, Thomas replied, his diplomatic instincts kicking in despite the precarious game before him. If I've been given incorrect information, that changes everything about our position. Something shifted in Varix's posture. Interesting. Your honesty earns you this. She tapped the board, and suddenly the dimensions of the game seemed to shift, revealing new pathways Thomas hadn't seen before. There is always more to the game than initially perceived, she said. This is your first lesson. With this new perspective, Thomas made a move that reclaimed one of his lost pieces. Varix's antennae twitched in what might have been surprise. "You understand the resonance paths already," she said. "Perhaps this will be more interesting than I thought." As the game progressed, Thomas began to see that Kaithvar wasn't merely about capturing pieces but about creating patterns across the board that strengthened some pieces while weakening others. The game had a flow to it, like a conversation or a dance, with each move revealing something about the player's mind. During a particularly intense exchange, Thomas noticed something odd. When Varix leaned forward to move a piece, the patterns on her exoskeleton pulsed in a sequence that matched the energy flows on the board. He began watching more carefully and realized there was a correlation between her bioluminescent displays and her strategy. "You're telegraphing your moves," he said without thinking. Varix froze, her four main hands hovering above the board. "Explain." Thomas hesitated, wondering if he'd made a mistake by revealing his observation. "Your bioluminescence. The patterns shift just before you make certain types of moves." For a moment, the throne room was utterly silent. Then, remarkably, Queen Varix began to emit a harmonious sound that Thomas realized was laughter. In 12,000 years of playing Kaithvar with non-Archeans, none have noticed that. She leaned closer, her alien features impossible to read. "You see more than expected, Thomas Mercer." She made her next move with deliberate slowness, and this time, Thomas noticed she controlled her bioluminescent patterns, keeping them steady. The game had just become more challenging. As the hours passed, Thomas lost more pieces than he gained, but he was learning. Each loss taught him something new about the game's multidimensional strategy. Despite his disadvantage, he managed to create a defensive formation that Varix found difficult to penetrate. "Most impressive for a first game," she acknowledged, her primary hands creating a gesture he couldn't interpret. "But now we move to the second phase." Without warning, the board shifted, elevating some sections while lowering others. The pieces remained in place, but the terrain of the game had completely transformed. "The world changes, diplomat," Varix said, her voice taking on a melodic quality that made Thomas's skin tingle. "Let us see how well you adapt." Thomas studied the new configuration, feeling a mixture of frustration and excitement. Just when he thought he understood the rules, the Queen changed them. But wasn't that exactly what happened in real diplomacy? He noticed her watching him intently, perhaps expecting frustration or confusion. Instead, Thomas smiled. "Change is humanity's natural environment, Your Majesty," he said, moving a piece along a newly created pathway. "We thrive on it." Something like respect flickered across Varix's alien features. She moved a piece in response, creating a complex pattern that threatened three of his pieces simultaneously. "Well played," she said. "But remember, diplomat, this game determines more than your freedom. It will reveal the true nature of your species to me." Thomas met her compound gaze steadily. "Then I had better make it a game worth remembering." As he contemplated his next move, Thomas couldn't help but notice that the distance between them across the board seemed to have diminished, and the Queen's attention on him had taken on a quality that wasn't entirely adversarial anymore. Something else was developing between them, a connection formed through the intricate dance of Kaithvar that transcended their alien differences. And somehow, Thomas sensed that this unexpected connection might prove to be his greatest advantage, or his most dangerous vulnerability. The third phase of Kaithvar began as crystalline mist rose from the board, each particle refracting light in a way that created ghostly projections above their pieces. Thomas watched, transfixed, as miniature holographic scenes played out above each move, consequences and potential futures shifting with each strategic choice. "Your mind adapts quickly," Queen Varix observed, her four primary hands moving with practiced precision as she shifted a copper piece. The air above it shimmered, displaying a brief vision of Thomas's blue pieces fracturing. Most non-Archeans find the consequence mist disorienting. "It's certainly distracting," Thomas admitted, trying not to let his gaze linger too long on the hypnotic projections. "But ultimately, it's just another form of information. The Queen's mandibles clicked in what he was beginning to recognize as amusement. Information and distraction are often the same thing, diplomat. The skilled mind knows which to focus on. Thomas noted how her exoskeleton's luminescence had subtly intensified, particularly around what would be the neck and shoulders on a human. He was learning to read her alien physiology, another advantage she hadn't anticipated. He moved his thought-bearer piece diagonally, creating a resonance pattern that strengthened 3 other pieces simultaneously. Above the board, the mist formed an image of blue light spreading through a copper lattice. Varix's compound eyes widened slightly. You're not just learning the rules, you're developing your own strategy. I'm a diplomat. Finding unexpected paths to connection is what I do. The Queen leaned forward, the distance between them narrowing. Thomas could smell her alien scent now, something like ozone and cinnamon. And is that what you seek with me, Thomas Mercer? Connection? Her voice had taken on a harmonic quality that seemed to resonate in his chest. Thomas maintained his composure, recognizing the psychological element of the game. I seek to understand you, Your Majesty. Understanding is the foundation of all meaningful connection. Something flickered across her features, surprise, perhaps. She hadn't expected him to meet her challenge directly. Understanding between our species has proven elusive. She made her move, an aggressive stance that threatened his central formation. Your kind sees 3 dimensions where we perceive 7. Your lifespans are brief flickers compared to ours. What meaningful connection could there be? Thomas studied the board, noticing how the pathways of energy flowed between his pieces and hers, not entirely separate, but part of a larger pattern they were creating together. Perhaps that's precisely what makes connection valuable, he replied, countering her move with one that didn't retreat but instead created a new configuration entirely. Different perspectives revealing aspects of reality the other cannot see alone. The game intensified as they entered the 4th hour. The guards remained motionless at the perimeter of the room, but Thomas sensed they were watching with increasing interest. This was no ordinary match of Caithvar. Queen Varix's moves became more aggressive, yet also more revealing. Each time she pressed an advantage, she exposed something of her strategy. Thomas began to recognize that her approach to the game mirrored what he knew of Archean diplomacy, overwhelming displays of strength covering subtle, intricate maneuvers. You're holding back, she said suddenly, her antennae quivering. Why? Thomas hadn't realized it himself until she pointed it out. He had been playing conservatively, measuring each move, revealing as little as possible about his strategy. Instinct, I suppose, he admitted. When facing a superior opponent, caution seems wise. Caution wins no victories, diplomat. Her voice dropped to a lower register that sent a strange shiver down his spine. Show me what humanity is truly capable of. The challenge in her words was unmistakable. Thomas looked at the board, then back at the alien queen. In that moment, he made a decision. His next move was bold, sacrificing 3 pieces in a configuration that seemed nonsensical. Varix's compound eyes blinked in rapid succession, her equivalent of a frown. You surrender these pieces without purpose? Thomas said nothing, waiting. 3 moves later, the purpose became clear as the sacrifice created a resonance pathway that reclaimed 5 of his lost pieces in a single maneuver. The mist above the board formed a spiraling double helix of blue and copper light. Varix went still, all 4 of her hands frozen above the board. Remarkable, she whispered. You created a temporal fold in the game space. Her eyes fixed on him with new intensity. No human has ever discovered that aspect of Caithvar before. I didn't discover it, Thomas said honestly. I observed how your pieces moved through the board's energy field and suspected there were connections I couldn't yet see. So you acted on faith that the pattern existed, even though you couldn't perceive it. She made a gesture with her secondary hands that Thomas couldn't interpret. Fascinating. The game's rhythm changed after that, becoming less adversarial and more collaborative. Though they were still opponents, each move now acknowledged the other's skill, creating increasingly complex patterns across the multidimensional board. As they played, Thomas became aware of subtle changes in the throne room itself. The living light above them had shifted to a blend of his blue and her copper, and the transparent floor beneath them now displayed creatures that seemed to be mimicking the patterns on the HFY board. "Your palace is responsive to the game," Thomas observed. "The palace is responsive to me," Varix corrected. Her exoskeleton's luminescence had formed patterns he hadn't seen before, intricate swirls that reminded him of ancient Earth calligraphy. "And I find myself responding to you." The statement hung in the air between them, charged with meaning Thomas couldn't fully decipher. Was this part of the game? Another layer of psychological warfare? Or something else entirely? He made his next move deliberately, maintaining eye contact with the Queen as he placed his piece. "The feeling is mutual, Your Majesty." Varix's antennae trembled slightly. She leaned closer across the board, her alien features somehow softer than before. "I begin to understand why your species has survived despite your limitations," she said. "You see patterns where others see only chaos. You adapt not merely to survive, but to transform the very conditions of your existence." Thomas noticed that the guards had moved closer, their posture suggesting confusion or concern. This interaction between their queen and the human prisoner was evidently unprecedented. "Is that not what all intelligent life strives for?" Thomas asked. "To shape our reality rather than merely endure it?" "Perhaps." Varix made a move that intertwined their pieces in a formation that was neither attack nor defense, but something new entirely. But few species possess both the vision and the audacity to attempt it. The consequence mist above their intertwined pieces formed an image unlike any Thomas had seen before, neither human nor Archean, but a complex structure that seemed to incorporate elements of both. As the game entered its fifth hour, Thomas realized something fundamental had changed. What had begun as a contest for his freedom had evolved into something far more profound, a communication beyond words, a meeting of alien minds through the shared language of HFY. And in the luminescent patterns dancing across Queen Varix's exoskeleton, Thomas began to recognize something unexpected and dangerous, a growing fascination that mirrored his own. The seventh hour of HFY brought a silence to the throne room that seemed almost reverential. The Archean guards had gradually formed a circle around the game, their normally rigid postures relaxed into attitudes of fascination. Thomas noticed that even the living ecosystem beneath the transparent floor had gone still, crystalline creatures gathering beneath the game board as if watching. Queen Varix moved a piece called the Crown Bearer into a position that threatened three of Thomas's strongest pieces simultaneously. The consequence mist formed an image of copper light consuming blue. "In this configuration, your defeat becomes inevitable within 12 moves, she said, her voice carrying a strange mixture of triumph and regret. "You have played remarkably, Thomas Mercer, but the game approaches its conclusion." Thomas studied the board, searching for options. The Queen was right, by any conventional strategy, his position was untenable. But something about the way the energy flowed through the pieces suggested a possibility he hadn't considered before. 12 moves is still 12 opportunities, he replied, moving his thought-bearer to a seemingly vulnerable position. Varix tilted her head, antennae quivering with curiosity. "You invite destruction of your central piece. An unusual surrender." "Not surrender. Transformation." Thomas placed his fingers on the thought-bearer and did something unprecedented. He rotated it 45 degrees on its axis. The piece flared with brilliant blue light, and suddenly every energy pathway on the board reconfigured. The throne room erupted in harmonic chittering from the guards. Queen Varix rose to her full height, all 4 primary arms extended in what might have been shock. "You cannot do that," she said, her voice resonating with multiple tones simultaneously. The pieces move across pathways, not around their own axis. You never said that was forbidden, Thomas countered calmly. You said perception shapes reality. I've merely changed my perception of how the piece relates to the board. For several tense moments, Varric stood motionless, her compound eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made the air between them feel electrically charged. Then, remarkably, she lowered herself back to her position and made a sound that Thomas now recognized as laughter. In 12,000 years of Caithvar matches, no one has ever attempted this. Her bioluminescent patterns swirled in complex formations. You truly are a unique specimen, Thomas Mercer. She studied the board, her four hands moving in intricate patterns above the pieces as she considered this new configuration. Then, to the obvious surprise of her guards, she reached for her crown-bearer and rotated it as Thomas had done with his piece. If we redefine the rules, she said, her eyes never leaving his, then we must both play by the new definition. What followed was unlike any game Thomas could have imagined. They began moving and rotating pieces in 3 dimensions, creating configurations that caused the consequence mist to form impossible geometric patterns above the board. The energy pathways no longer simply connected pieces but wove between them in a complex dance of light and shadow. After a particularly audacious move by Thomas that reversed the polarity of 3 pieces simultaneously, Varric leaned forward, her alien features impossible to read. You don't play to win, she observed. You play to transform the game itself. Thomas met her gaze steadily. Isn't that the most interesting victory of all? Something changed in her posture then, a subtle shift that somehow made her seem less alien, more accessible. Perhaps, for your kind, changing the rules is easier than mastering them. Or perhaps, Thomas countered, mastery sometimes means recognizing when the rules themselves are incomplete. As he spoke, he made a move that created a perfect balance between his pieces and hers, a configuration where neither could advance without disrupting a harmony that had emerged between them. The consequence mist above the board formed a stable, pulsing structure that incorporated both blue and copper in equal measure. What do you call this? Varric asked, her voice softer than he had heard it before. On Earth, we would call it a stalemate, Thomas replied. Neither player can win without destroying the balance. And if the balance itself becomes more valuable than victory? Her secondary hands made a gesture Thomas hadn't seen before, something that seemed almost tentative. Then perhaps we've discovered a new game entirely. Varric rose from her position, circling the board slowly. The guards shifted nervously, but she silenced them with a gesture. When she completed her circuit, she stood directly beside Thomas, close enough that he could feel the strange heat emanating from her exoskeleton. You were brought before me as a prisoner, she said, her voice carrying throughout the chamber despite its softness. You were offered a game with clear stakes, your freedom for victory, servitude for defeat. Thomas remained still, acutely aware of her proximity. Those were the terms. But you have created an outcome that existed in neither possibility. She extended one of her primary hands, the luminescence of her exoskeleton pulsing in patterns that somehow matched his heartbeat. This is not victory, not defeat, but synthesis. Thomas slowly rose to his feet, finding himself eye level with the alien queen. The guards tensed, but Varric waved them back. What does synthesis mean for our agreement? Thomas asked, aware that his future, and possibly the future relationship between humanity and the Archean Empire, hung on her answer. It means, Varric said, her voice taking on a harmonic quality that seemed to resonate within his chest, that neither of us can proceed as we were before. With deliberate slowness, she extended a secondary hand and touched his face, her exoskeleton surprisingly warm and smooth against his skin. Thomas remained perfectly still, recognizing the significance of the gesture. The ancient laws of right of mind are clear, she continued. One who can match the queen's thought path cannot be subject nor sovereign, but must be equal. The word hung in the air between them, charged with implications that Thomas could barely comprehend. The guards had gone completely still, as if witnessing something momentous. Equal, Thomas repeated carefully. And what does that mean, practically speaking? Varix's compound eyes reflected his image back at him 1,000 times over, but now there was something new in her gaze, a recognition that transcended their alien differences. It means, Thomas Mercer, that you are no longer a prisoner, nor merely a diplomat. Her hand remained on his face, the touch no longer alien but familiar. You have earned a place in the Archean court that no human, no non-Archean, has ever held before. She stepped closer, the distance between them now intimate by any species standard. Her luminescence had shifted to patterns that somehow complemented his own human coloring, as if their very biologies were finding harmony. And what place is that, exactly? Thomas asked, his voice steady despite the strange tension between them. That, Queen Varix said, her voice dropping to a register that sent a shiver down his spine, is what we must discover together. As they stood before the balanced game board, surrounded by the astonished Archean court, Thomas realized he had achieved something far more significant than winning his freedom. He had initiated a transformation in the relationship between their species, and perhaps in the Queen herself. And as her luminescence pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, he understood that the true game was only just beginning. The royal chambers of Queen Varix were unlike anything Thomas had ever seen. Walls of living crystal pulsed with bioluminescence that responded to movement and emotion, creating an environment that seemed to breathe with its occupants. The central space opened to a vast dome that revealed not the sky of the Archean homeworld, but a swirling nebula captured somehow in real time, stars being born and dying in accelerated time. 3 days had passed since the unprecedented Caithvar match. Thomas had been moved from the prisoner quarters to a suite adjacent to the royal chambers, furnished with a curious blend of human comforts and Archean aesthetics. The diplomatic crisis that had led to his capture seemed distant now, replaced by something far more complex and intimate. The Thalian sector reports have been corrected, Varix said, entering the chamber without announcement. Her exoskeleton gleamed in the starlight, the copper hue deepened to an almost crimson shade that Thomas had come to recognize as her evening coloration. Your superiors were indeed misinformed. The boundary markers were deliberately altered by a third party. Thomas turned from the nebula view. The Meridian Collective? They've been trying to provoke conflict between our species for years. Precisely. She moved toward him with that fluid grace that had become increasingly mesmerizing to him. Representatives from Earth will arrive tomorrow to renegotiate under the new understanding. Your status will be explained to them. Thomas nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure his own status had been adequately explained to him. And what exactly will you tell them? Varix's secondary hands made a gesture he now recognized as amusement. That the human diplomat Thomas Mercer has been appointed royal consort and ambassador plenipotentiary to the Archean Empire, following the ancient laws of right of mind. Consort, Thomas repeated, the word heavy with implications. Your people accept this? Some do not, she admitted, her luminescence patterns shifting to more serious configurations. But the Caithvar is sacred to us. Its outcomes cannot be disputed, even when unprecedented. She moved closer, her alien features somehow no longer foreign to him. The question that remains is whether you accept it. Thomas considered everything that had transpired since that fateful game. The boundaries between diplomatic necessity and personal desire had blurred in ways he'd never anticipated. What had begun as a desperate play for survival had evolved into something that defied conventional understanding. I'm still learning what it means, he said truthfully. Varix's compound eyes regarded him with an intensity that had become familiar. Then let me show you. She extended all 4 of her primary hands, an Archean gesture of complete openness. Thomas stepped forward and placed his human hands in her upper pair. Her exoskeleton was warm against his skin, vibrating subtly with what he now recognized as emotional resonance. "In the old stories," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to bypass his ears and resonate directly in his chest, "when the stars were young and species first met among them, there were those who found connection despite their differences. They were called the translated, beings who learned to read each other across the void of alien perception." As she spoke, the patterns of light across her body shifted, forming configurations that Thomas somehow understood as clearly as spoken language. Her secondary hands rose to touch his face, tracing the contours that were so different from her own. "I never believed such connection was possible," she continued. "Humans were merely another brief species to be managed in the cosmic order." Her antennae trembled slightly. "Until you rotated the thought-bearer and changed everything." Thomas found himself responding to her proximity in ways that transcended diplomatic calculation. There was something between them now, something that had begun during those hours across the Kathvar board and had been growing ever since. "We called it thinking outside the box," he said with a small smile. "I never expected it to be quite so literal." Varix made that harmonious sound he recognized as laughter. "Your species' greatest strength is seeing patterns where others cannot, even when the pattern requires reshaping reality itself." She stepped closer, the distance between them now intimate by any species standard. Thomas felt the strange heat of her exoskeleton, saw the luminescence shifting to patterns he'd come to recognize as desire. "The translated were feared by some," she said, her voice dropping lower, "because they reshaped boundaries thought immutable. They proved that connection could exist even between forms that evolved under different stars." Thomas felt her secondary hands move to his shoulders, the touch no longer alien but welcome. "Is that what we're doing? Reshaping boundaries?" "We already have," Varix replied. Her face moved closer to his, antennae gently brushing his forehead in what he'd learned was an intimate Archean gesture. "The question is whether you wish to continue." The moment hung between them, charged with possibility. Thomas knew that whatever happened next would define not just his future, but potentially the relationship between their species for generations to come. Yet in this moment, politics seemed far away, replaced by something more primal and honest. His answer came not in words but in action. He leaned forward, closing the final distance between them, and pressed his lips gently against the smooth surface just above her mandibles, the Archean equivalent of a kiss. Her exoskeleton flared with brilliant copper light, luminescence cascading across her body in waves that matched the sudden racing of his heart. Varix responded with a sound unlike any he'd heard before, a harmonic resonance that seemed to vibrate through his entire body. Her four primary arms encircled him, drawing him closer, while her secondary hands traced patterns across his face and neck that sent shivers down his spine. "Your form is so different," she whispered, her voice carrying tones that humans weren't meant to hear but that Thomas somehow understood. "Yet I find it perfect." What followed was an encounter that defied description in any human language. Their bodies, evolved under different stars for different environments, found ways to connect that transcended biological design. Her exoskeleton grew warm and yielding to his touch, while his skin became hypersensitive to the patterns of light that played across her form. They communicated through a language of touch and resonance, finding unexpected harmonies between their alien physiologies. Hours later, as the captured nebula overhead swirled with the birth of new stars, they lay entwined on a surface that conformed to both their bodies, her luminescence pulsing in rhythm with his breathing. "Tomorrow," Varix said softly, her antennae gently caressing his face, "when your people arrive, everything changes." Thomas nodded, aware of the weight of what lay ahead. "They'll have questions. Concerns. This isn't exactly standard diplomatic procedure." "No," she agreed, a ripple of amusement in her harmonic voice. "It is something far older and more powerful." Thomas propped himself up on one elbow, looking at the alien queen who had somehow become so much more than an adversary or ally. "They'll want to know if I'm acting under coercion." If I've been compromised. Verix's compound eyes studied him with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see through all pretense. And what will you tell them? He considered the question carefully, aware of its implications for both their futures. That I came here to forge a connection between our species and succeeded in ways no one could have predicted. Her luminescence brightened with pleasure. A diplomatic answer. But not a dishonest one. He traced the patterns on her exoskeleton, watching the light follow his fingers. What happened between us wasn't planned or calculated. It simply evolved. Like all the best things in the universe, Verix agreed. She rose in a fluid motion, her form silhouetted against the cosmic backdrop. The translated of old were said to become something greater than the sum of their different parts. Neither one species nor another, but something new entirely. Thomas joined her, standing before the swirling nebula that seemed somehow symbolic of their unlikely union, chaotic forces coming together to create something unexpected and beautiful. Is that what we're becoming? He asked. We have already begun, she replied, taking his hands in hers. The question is where it leads. As they stood together, human and Archean, diplomat and queen, the boundaries between them continued to dissolve. Thomas realized that his capture and the game of Caithvar had been merely the opening moves in a much larger cosmic game, one that might reshape the relationship between their species and perhaps the galaxy itself. He had come to the Archean Empire to negotiate for a sector of space. Instead, he had found something far more valuable, a connection that transcended the void between alien minds and hearts. And as Queen Verix's luminescence synchronized with his heartbeat, Thomas Mercer understood that their story was not ending but truly beginning, a new chapter in the ancient cosmic dance of life, finding life among the stars, reaching across the darkness to touch, connect, and transform.